At the beginning of this year, I thought it would be fun to make a video about games that I'm looking forward to being released in 2020, and then my life completely crumbled around me, and it wasn't until recently that I finally got back to that idea again. Except now that we're this far into 2020, I figured I better make it a simpler focus of games that I'm looking forward to seeing when they're released. That being said, release schedules are a little bit weird because you'll look up a game on BoardGameGeek.com and you'll see a release year, and often you won't actually have a wide release to retail until maybe even the following year. And here in Canada, we might get it much later than in the US or parts of Europe. But the point is that even a game that has a 2019 release date on it can be a game that hasn't yet hit the Canadian market here. So I've generally just looked at games that had a release date of 2019 or later, although I did sneak in a couple of 2018 games that I haven't yet had a chance to check out. Now, this ended up being a really difficult exercise because my life has really fallen apart and I have lost the loved ones that were my game partners. I was looking through this wish list of games that I had been eagerly anticipating to play with these people and realizing that it's just not going to happen. So I had to take a lot of games off my wish list that didn't have a solo mode, now that I have no gaming friends. And even then, I'm just not a solo gamer. So most of these games I'm looking at on the wish list, I'm realizing I'm just never going to play these games. But even more heartbreakingly, I'm not going to play them with people that I was really looking forward to exploring them with. So it was a really heart-wrenching process. And a much longer one than I was anticipating. Even having taken a bunch of games off of the list, I still ended up with 75 games here, split into 5 different categories. I have a list of games that I'd like to check out to possibly play with my kids, and there's 12 games in that list. And then the rest are ranked from thinking about it, which has 38 games in it, to like to have, which has 16 games in it, to love to have, which has 7, and finally the must-have games, which has 3 games in that final list. So with 75 games to get through, I'm only going to do a 5 or 10 second blurb on most of these, and I better get right to it. The games in each of these 5 categories are listed in alphabetical order. So the first one in this list of games that I'm looking forward to checking out to play with my kids potentially is Adventure Tactics Damien's Tower. This is a fantasy-themed, encounter-based, cooperative, tactical combat game that is played over a branching campaign with 50 different chapters and that leads to 5 different potential endings to the campaign. This is one of the more promising titles because it also has really cute artwork. So combined with this big campaign, it's one that I could definitely see checking out with my kids. The next one is Andor Jr. This is a cooperative fantasy adventure game that is based on Legends of Andor, which is actually a game I've never played, but looks to be a fun adventure game. Then there's Century Golem Edition Eastern Mountains. We've had a lot of fun playing the original Century Golem Edition, so I'd like to check out this expansion, although I don't know if it would push the complexity level too far for my kids. I'll have to check that out before I get too far into that particular game. Next up is another expansion, which is Downforce Wild Ride. It's an expansion for a fun racing and betting game that's been a huge hit with my older boy in particular. We have the previous expansion tracks that have been released for this game, and I'm looking forward to checking out the latest one. We have another expansion with Dungeon Mayhem Monster Madness. This has been a fun card game that's been a big hit with both boys, and we recently picked up the other expansion that's available for Dungeon Mayhem, and I'm definitely going to pick up this one when it is released. Up next is Harry Potter Death Eaters Rising. This is a cooperative dice game that my older boy might enjoy after we finished playing through Harry Potter Hogwarts Battle. It looks like it has some surface similarities at least, and might be one that he's interested in checking out. Next is Kingdom Rush Rift in Time, a 1 to 4 player cooperative fantasy campaign game with cute art. Again, I'm always interested in fantasy campaigns when it comes to playing with the kids. Next is Oh Fox, an animal game of hidden movement, simultaneous action selection, bluffing, and deduction. Anything that includes a deduction and bluffing element is a game that I'm interested in, and this one has a cute animal theme on top of it, so we'll see if it looks like one that my kids might enjoy. Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid is next on the list, and it's a cooperative game of Power Rangers battling against minions, monsters, and eventually a final boss. My kids aren't huge into the Power Rangers stuff, although I think they've watched some of that show and would probably be interested in the theme regardless. And then we have Sherlock Holmes Baker Street Irregulars. This is the next comic book style choose your own adventure game from the makers of the Crusoe Crew. This is one I'm not sure about because with my wife having split, we're not going to be able to finish the Crusoe Crew as a family, even though it was a huge hit with the kids. So if I do finish the Crusoe Crew, it'll have to be with the three of us, and I'm just not sure if I can bring myself to do that or not. We'll have to see. Next is Tales of Glory. This one goes back to 2018. This is one I snuck on the list even though it might be a couple years old already. This is a simple and fast game of fantasy heroes who are trying to earn the most glory in the kingdom, and it seems to be built around an interesting tile placement system. This one looks really promising, and I could definitely see myself picking this one up. And then the final one in the kids list is Wander, the Cult of Barnacle Bay. It is a big 1 to 5 player cooperative campaign-driven miniatures board game that appears to be a dungeon crawl style of scenario game with cute animal characters representing the figures. This one looks heavily inspired by Arcadia Quest, which is a game my kids have had a ton of fun with. I think they both listed it as their #1 or #2 game of all time. And it could be a good next step for them once we finished with Arcadia Quest. Or maybe it'll be a little too similar and we might be ready for something different. I'm not really sure about that one. So that's it for the kids stuff, and now we'll get into the bottom rank of the anticipated adult games, starting with the thinking about it category of my wish list. The first game here is Adventure Inc. 5 Factions of Filigree. It is a 1 to 6 player storytelling game of exploration and adventure that is described as a write and role playing game. For example, it uses a dry erase game board. Could be fun. Next is Adventure of D 2nd Edition. I'm not familiar with Adventure of D 1st Edition, but apparently more D is a good thing. It's apparently a 1 to 3 player fantasy adventure card game that looks pretty light and quick, so it could be an easy one to get to the table potentially. Up next is Alter Quest, which is a 1 to 4 player, quick playing fantasy adventure game. Another one in the list of quicker playing titles, which don't have a huge representation in the list of adult games. A lot of these tend to be bigger campaign driven games, so anytime we see a quicker playing one, that has a better chance of maybe making it to the table. Next we have Cloudspire, a 1 to 4 player battle game with unique factions and both armies and individual heroes on the map. I have no idea how they've done a solo mode for this one because it looks like quite a competitive game, but it might be interesting to check out. Next is Contact, a cooperative space adventure game based around deduction that could be fun to play with my friend who works for the Planetary Society. And as always, I'm a sucker for deduction games. Cosmic Colonies is next. It's a 1 to 5 player science fiction game utilizing tile placement, and it's by Scott Alms, who has done a couple of really excellent games that I've enjoyed in the past. Speaking of great designers, we have Cuba Toast, a dice-rolling push-your-luck race game designed by John D. Clare, who came up with that brilliant card crafting system with partially clear cards that allow you to physically alter what is on your cards as the game progresses. I don't think that system is in this game per se, but it shows that he has some interesting ideas about game mechanics. Next is the Defense of Procyon 3, a highly asymmetric 2 versus 2 game, although it states 1 to 4 players, of sci-fi, space, and ground combat with, quote, countless high-quality miniatures in a rich thematic world. I'm as much a sucker for lots of minis and rich theme as anybody else, although I no longer allow myself to get dragged into those Kickstarters. I do tend to wait now for retail releases of games due to the cost of shipping these days. Anyways, Escape Plan is the next on the list. It's a 1 to 5 player game where players are criminals who are attempting to escape the city after a successful bank heist before the cops can catch up with and capture them. This is a really intriguing looking game with an interesting theme of trying to outrun the cops and get out of the city. And then we have Eternal Chronicles of the Throne, a deck-building battling game with gorgeous art and graphic design by the designer of my favorite game that utilizes deck building, Clank. Anytime the designer of Clank comes up with a card game, I am definitely interested. Forgotten Wars is next. It's a big cooperative crossroads game set in a world of fantastical pirate adventure that appears to have a choose-your-own-adventure style location book and an explorable map. Now this doesn't look like one that could be played solo, so I'm really not sure that this is one that I'd get played. Next is The Hobbit, An Unexpected Party. It's a game based solely around the dwarves' evening in Bilbo's house when they first met him, where your goal is to annoy Bilbo, but not too much apparently. In any case, I'm currently reading The Hobbit to my older boy, so as a result of that, we might be interested in checking this out if it turns out to be a decent game. Next is Lands of Galzir, a 1-to-4 player campaign-based open-world adventure game that's co-designed by the designer of Dawn of Peacemakers. A game I haven't gotten to the table yet, but it has a very interesting premise of being peacemakers in a war between animals. I'm particularly interested in the aspect of open-world adventuring that is part of Lands of Galzir, apparently. Moving on to Lions of Lydia. It's a nice-looking, light and quick bag management and engine building game about the dawn of currency in the ancient world. It's definitely more of a Euro-style game than a lot of these very thematic games that make my list, but it looks light and easy to play, and it's really quite well done in terms of the graphic design as well. Next is Lost Atlantis, which is described as a 3X game under the sea. Hopefully the X they've left out of the 4X is extermination, because I'm not so fond of attacking other players anymore. And it has art by Vincent Dutrait, so you combine the fact that it's an undersea theme, which always intrigues me, and it's Vincent Dutrait who's bringing that to visual life. That sounds really intriguing to me. Up next is Maglev Metro, a 1-to-4 player futuristic pick up and deliver tile laying engine building train game. I mentioned my love of deduction mechanics. Another thing that always gets me is when you can do route building and pick up and deliver. I always find that to be a satisfying experience. Next is The Melt. It's a 1-to-4 player cooperative game, possibly about futuristic ocean exploration, though there's very little info available on this one yet. I'll have to stay tuned for some better descriptions. And then we have Mercado de Lisboa, which is a thinky tile placement game that plays in 15 to 30 minutes despite the depth to the gameplay, and it was co-designed by Vital Lacerda, who's a famous designer as well. I'm a sucker for quick playing simple games that have a lot of depth despite their simplicity, so I'm interested in checking that one out for sure. Next is Madera, Unintentional Malum Act 1. It's a 1-to-4 player cooperative choose-your-own-adventure style miniatures board game in a modern fantasy setting that is based around a narrative-driven campaign. This is one that already has other acts released, so for people who enjoy the first one, there's already more content available, as far as I can tell. Next is No Dawn, a 1-to-5 player, scenario-driven, cooperative, tower defense style game that supposedly introduces unique twists to the common mechanisms of worker placement and deck building, though every other new game that comes along claims to bring something unique to the table, and they rarely do. And then we have Nova Luna, which is a quick and simple 1-to-4 player game of tile placement that was co-designed by Uwe Rosenberg. Certainly, if anyone knows how to do tile placement, it's Mr. Rosenberg. But moving on now to Oath, Chronicles of Empire and Exile, which is a 1-to-6 player legacy-style campaign game that takes place in a fantasy kingdom. One of the truly heartbreaking things about having lost my gaming loved ones is the fact that they were also my legacy group, and the legacy game experiences we've had together have been just simply the best board gaming experiences I've ever had. So I'm always interested when I see legacy style, but now I would have to do it on my own if I were to explore it. And now we have Obscurio, a cooperative group game of exploration and deduction, but with a hidden traitor. This one is even less likely to get to the table due to the fact that it requires several players to play the game. Next is Ultrae, a game co-designed by Antoine Bauza and illustrated by Vincent Dutrait that is based on an RPG and is played via scenarios that are not linked by a campaign. So they are just one-off scenarios that you can explore, I guess. And then there's Paleo. Besides being a dumb fad diet, it's a cooperative adventure game set in the Stone Age that includes several modules for a variety of people, locations, quests, etc. for variety in gameplay. Most cooperative games, even if they aren't designed to be played solo, can easily be played solo, so it's definitely one that stays on the list. And then we have Enroll, which is supposedly an uncharacteristically deep and long roll and write game for 1 to 4 players with the theme of building up a Roman Empire. I've never been overly interested in the whole roll and write thing, but with a deeper game attached to it, I am actually more interested in checking it out. And then we have Rurik Dawn of Kiev, a 1 to 4 player dudes on a map style area control game based on a mechanism that they call auction programming with an 11th century Eastern European historical setting. As much as I do love fantasy settings, I'm also a history fan, so a historical setting will always capture my interest as well. Shadows of Brimstone, Gates of Valhalla is next on the list. It's a 1 to 4 player game where players are a cooperating team of Viking heroes who are exploring the icy crags and snowy forests of the Norselands that are filled with snarling beasts and mythological creatures who have become emboldened by the power of the Dark Stone. I'm personally not familiar with any of the other Shadows of Brimstone stuff, but Norse mythology and loads of Viking and monster minis are definitely going to grab my attention every time. Next is Skull Tales Full Sail! This is a 1 to 5 player, semi-cooperative, whatever that means, pirate adventure game with several RPG-like elements. It's kind of strange that it's described as semi-cooperative, and yet you can somehow play the game solo too. Not sure how that works. Next, Small Islands, a 1 to 4 player, quick tile placement game of exploring a resource-rich archipelago. Now, another game mechanism that I just love is tile placement, especially when it's combined with an exploration element. That's just something that draws me into games. And then we have You've Been Eaten, period. I love that there's a period in the title of this game because you tend to see so many games that have an exclamation point in the title, but I think this is the first that has just a straight up period at the end of "So you've been eaten." Statement over. This is a 1 to 2 player adventure game of trying to escape the belly of a giant space beast that is also designed by Scott Almes. And now we have an expansion for a brilliant cooperative game. This is Spirit Island Jagged Earth. The truly brilliant co-op game Spirit Island only survived my wife separation collection call due to its solo ability, and I already have the Branch and Claw expansion and the promo Spirits, so I really do have enough in the box to last me for years. But some of the spirits in Jagged Earth do look pretty cool, so I have my eye on it anyways. Next is Terramara, a pleasant-looking game of resource collection and conversion that looks to be the sort of longer Euro-style game that I typically avoid, but something about this one just looks really appealing to me. I'm a sucker for good visuals in a game, even if the mechanisms aren't typically ones that I would be drawn to. Now we have Tidal Blade Heroes of the Reef. This is a 1 to 4 player of fantasy heroes who are gathering resources to face challenges using a bunch of dice and some sort of mechanisms that utilize lots of dials on player boards. But mainly I've heard from some reviewers that this is quite a fun little game. Next, Trudvang Legends is a 1 to 4 player cooperative game from CMON based on an RPG where players are heroes from Nordic and Celtic myths and sagas who physically alter the world they inhabit as time goes by. So I'm definitely a sucker for anything Nordic and Celtic. Those are themes that are some of my favorites to explore. And if it's a campaign that allows you to change the world, then I'm really interested. Next is Unsettled, a cooperative game of surviving a long space journey that has no enemies and no combat, only an environment where supposedly every step, every breath, every particle around you could mean immediate, terrifying death. I love the idea of a challenging game where you don't have to fight and kill things, but you're just left to survive a harsh environment. Sounds cool. Next up, Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. This is one that I'm sure has been out for a while already, but it's a 1 to 5 player cooperative, apparently scenario-based dungeon delving adventure game that I could see my Magic the Gathering playing friend enjoying with me in a world where we could actually sit around a table together. I'm still peering in from the edges of the minis gaming world with stuff like this on my shelf and looking at this Warhammer Quest game. I imagine I could get sucked into it if I had an opponent that enjoyed that type of thing. But last up in the like to have category is Whistle Mountain. I owned and enjoyed Whistle Stop, but had to sell it due to a lack of opponents to play it with, so I'm interested in checking out this game of worker placement and tile placement with variable player powers in a world of hot air balloons, blimps, and dreadnoughts. Steampunk is another aesthetic that I discovered through board gaming, specifically with the game Mission Red Planet, and I've loved it as a theme in games ever since. But anyways, that wraps up that category, and we're going to move up now to the like-to-have games. Just before we go on to this category, I'd like to ask you to check out my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below this video. Even pledging for a couple dollars per month would be something that would be helpful to me over the long term. And that's it. I won't belabor the point. Let's get back to the games. So the first in the like-to-have category is 303 Squadron. This is a 1-to-4 player Second World War aerial combat game about the Battle of Britain, featuring plastic aircraft on flight stands. Now, one thing about me, when I was a kid, one of the earliest style of books I really got into were First and Second World War biographies and autobiographies of the flying aces. These Knights of the Air really fascinated me, as did the big battles like the Battle of Britain and the Battle of Midway, and these conflicts that really heavily featured the aerial combat. So this one would probably be right up my alley with regards to all of that stuff. Now, next we have the Seventh Citadel. I have had no interest in the Seventh Continent, but I am interested in this 1-to-4 player choose-your-own-adventure fantasy game of exploration that has a listed playtime of 5 minutes to 1,000 minutes. And I'm largely interested in it because I've heard that they eliminated the having to grind and redo stuff you've already done. That's what made the original one a hard pass for me, but this one I could get interested in. Up next is Adventure Games The Dungeon, which is a 1-to-4 player narrative-based game of exploration and unraveling a mystery that starts out in a medieval dungeon. Even as a solo experience, it could be fun to delve into that particular mystery. Next is Cairn. This one looks like one of those light and quick but fairly deep 2-player games that I'm such a sucker for, that Bruno Catala in particular does so well. The problem now is, of course, having that second player to play with. But moving on to Fairy Trails, it's a quick and simple tile-laying game for 1 to 2 players by Uwe Rosenberg again. Yet again, Mr. Rosenberg brings a tile-laying game to the table, and once again, I'm interested in checking it out. Moving on to a bigger game, we have Metal Gear Solid, the board game, which is a 1-to-4 player cooperative minis game of accomplishing missions throughout a campaign. I don't know a thing about the Metal Gear Solid video game, but this board game looks quite interesting to me. Next is Monumental, a beautifully illustrated 1-to-4 player, card-driven civilization building game with loads of cool minis. I love a good Civ game, and Clash of Cultures is in my top 5 of all time, I believe. If not, it's definitely top 10. Moving on now to My City, which is another legacy-style game, but this one is designed by Kinesia, and it's based on tile placement. So again, without the group to explore it with, I don't know if I would ever get a chance to play it, but it's on my list anyhow. Perseverance Castaway Chronicles is next. It's a 1-to-4 player dice drafting / dice placement game of building up a settlement on an island inhabited by dinosaurs over the course of 4 connected scenarios. There's dinosaurs in the description, there's dinosaurs on the box. That's all I need to know to be interested. Now we have Rallyman GT, a 1-to-6 player racing game that utilizes a clever dice-based system that is slightly reminiscent to me of Formula Day / Formula D / Formula Day Mini. I heard on the Dig and Dent podcast that this was a really fun one, so I'm definitely interested. Now here's another Civ game. It's Rise and Fall. It's a quick-playing civilization building game with no luck elements by Christophe Bollinger, the brilliant designer of Dungeon Twister, Earth Reborn, and Archipelago. Archipelago? I don't know. Anyways, Earth Reborn in particular is a game that could have been amongst my favorite games of all time if I had a player who was willing to explore that whole game with me. The thing is, it's such a huge, complex game that required learning over the course of several plays, and just ultimately ended up being too much of a commitment to explore. But Rise and Fall is supposedly a quick-playing Civ game, so I am interested. Now we have Running Quest Soul Raiders, which is a 1-to-4 player cooperative game of fantasy, adventure, and exploration that provides a strong narrative experience over the course of several chapters that comprise an entire campaign. By now, I'm sure you're seeing some common threads: fantasy, adventure, exploration, campaigns. You're going to see more of that coming up. But not with Trails of Tucana, which is a 1-to-8 player flip and write game of creating a network of roads that plays in 15 minutes. This is one of those light flip and write / roll and write style games, but I get to build a network of roads, which, like I said, with the whole network building and pick up and deliver stuff is something that always catches my interest. Now we sail down to Venice, which is a possibly too heavy and too long Euro-style game of moving gondolas up and down the canals of Venice to do economic stuff. But it looks really nice, and I am a sucker for pick up and deliver, like I've mentioned, especially when you have vehicles that you can physically put your little goods on and transport them along the map. So this one is the mechanisms and the whole look of the game that really draw me in. And now the last in the like to have category is Die Vikinger Saga, a game based on deck building where players are Viking Jarls who are adventuring through 9 different Norse mythological worlds. And there's that Norse mythology again that captures my interest every time. And now we take yet another step up to my love to have category, which has the following 7 games. Firstly is Arceus, a 1 to 5 player cooperative story-driven campaign game with minis that is set among ancient Egyptian ruins and is co-designed by Corentin Lebrat, Ludovic Maublanc, and Théo Rivière. So a couple of big names behind this ancient Egyptian mythological game. And the designer is partly what appeals to me about Lydia, The Paths We Dare Tread. This one is an open-world, cooperative fantasy game built on 4 design pillars: exploration, progression, combat, and role-playing. And this one comes from Cody Miller, who designed Xia, Legends of a Drift System. I owned Xia for a while and thought it was a pretty fun adventure game with some serious design flaws. And I'm interested in seeing how Cody has progressed and matured as a designer with Lydia. Now we're coming to a game that could very easily be in the must-have category if it weren't for the price of it. And this is Hellenica, Story of Greece. It is a huge 1 to 7 player ancient civilization game with cool plastic minis for the cities, and at least through the Kickstarter, optional minis for the soldiers as well. So now we have a big Civ game set in the ancient world that can be played solo, and I'm so tempted by this, especially since I believe the expansion is hitting Kickstarter in the near future, which means that the whole game will probably be available again. And I could be tempted back to Kickstarter, perhaps as a birthday present for myself, with this being my birthday month. And now we shoot up to space with Planet Unknown, a 1 to 6 player game of colonizing Mars using polyomino shapes that is currently on Kickstarter. I've kept a very close eye on all of Uwe Rosenberg's polyomino tile-laying games because there's something about that mechanism that really appeals to me, and yet I haven't found a game that's really captured my interest based around that mechanism. But this one looks really interesting. Next up is a history theme with Undaunted Normandy, a 2-player tactical World War II game that's powered by a deck-building mechanism, and that I would pick up in an instant if I had a regular opponent to play it with. It would definitely be a must-have if I knew somebody who was interested in that historical theme and would enjoy a deck-building game. This one I have seen on the shelves of my local gaming store, but like I said, no opponent to play it with. And finally, we have a couple of expansion elements for all of this Warhammer Underworld's Night Vault stuff, which are Warhammer Underworld's Night Vault, the Forbidden Chambers board pack, and the Mirrored City boards pack. I mean, sure, I would love to add a couple of extra boards to my newly acquired collection of Night Vault stuff, although it'll still be months before I have the warbands actually assembled and painted and ready to play, let alone somebody to actually play them with, so I don't know, it would be nice to have anyhow. Moving up still further from the love to have into the must have category, where we have 2 games and 1 expansion. The first game is Dead Reckoning, a pirate game by John D. Clare, who I mentioned earlier of Mythic Vale fame, that hits so many of my soft spots in gaming. It's a pirate game. You need to explore the seas. You upgrade your ship. Your crew is upgraded using the Mythic Vale card crafting system. There's a cube tower for battles, and the game uses a saga system in which certain content remains hidden and is discovered and added to the game organically only via playing. So rather than adding everything at once, you gradually add it by playing and discovering it. Now I will say though that this game almost dropped down to the love to have category when I saw a couple of photographs, because apparently this cube tower, which I was so excited about, was not the Wallenstein/Shogun /Amerigo style of cube tower that I was really hoping it would be. I've been really wanting another great game to come along that utilizes that type of cube tower, but it's simply a place to drop cubes in and they fall out onto this little mat that resolves some combat stuff, I guess. So while it was a disappointing blow to discover that that's not the type of cube tower that's in the game, there's still enough that really holds my interest to keep it in the must-have category. And now we have a wee little expansion called Mr. Jack Pocket Extension. Mr. Jack Pocket is this tiny little brain-burny two-player puzzle-y game that I've played a lot more on my phone than actually in real life. However, I'm a complete sucker for all things Mr. Jack related, with that being, I think, in the top 3 games of all time for me. So it's one that I would get if I could get a hold of it. And now one that I just can't seem to get hold of, my final one, and the one that I most want more than any of the other games on this entire list, and that is Verona Twist, a little game that came out in Hungary, I think it was, in 2018, but that I can't find anywhere in North America. The design of this game was clearly inspired by Mr. Jack, which, like I just said, is one of my top 3 games of all time. So I've been so eager to get hold of this one and give it a try, but I just can't find it anywhere. I even tried going on to Hungarian websites, but even with the help of some translate, I couldn't get anything figured out in terms of ordering the game or anything like that. So I'm going to have to maybe find somebody who can track that down in Europe for me. I'm not sure how that's going to work out, but I would love to have Verona Twist. And there you go, that's 75 games, of which I might end up owning 2 or 3 of them if I'm lucky. I'm particularly interested in finding a soloable fantasy adventure campaign game, of which there were several on this list, and I just have to sort of keep researching and figuring out which one sort of rises to the top amongst all of the ones that are on my watch list here. I'm a sucker for a good theme that is combined with a good story, although it's weird because the thing is, with board gaming narrative, there's just not a lot of great writing out there. In fact, with the exception of Pandemic Legacy Season 1, I can't think of any board game that had really solid writing that combined with good gameplay. It's still kind of a unicorn I'm chasing, I guess, and maybe one day I'll find something like that. But what about you? What games are you excited about? What games are you wanting to hear more about as we eventually start to socialize again and get into some sort of convention seasons down the road? I'm sure my list has room for a few more games if you come up with something good for me. Oh my gosh, I am so glad somebody took the time to watch this video. If you could just do me one more favor and consider giving me a thumb up, maybe subscribe to my channel, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it, I would really appreciate that. Cheers. Except now, being this far into 2020, I sort of thought I figured I'd better refocus it to games that I'm in. And let's... works for the Planetary Society. A game I still have yet to get. Maybe I want to ask you to check out my Patreon page. And consider which is linked in the description below this video. I would like one of the first I don't know if I'd ever get a chance to play this one, but I don't know if my God. So a couple big names behind this this one I have seen on the shores. Now we have a little wee expansion, which is Mr. Jack Pocket